My name is Evelyn Mercer, and I was 32 years old the night my father looked across my dining room table and told me to return a child, like she was a wrong item in a grocery bag. It was Father's Day, the 15th of June 2025. I remember the date because the peach cobbler my mother brought still had the grocery store label stuck to the plastic lid, and my mother only bought dessert when she was preparing to say something she did not want to soften with flour and butter. Caleb sat beside me in his little Durham Bulls t-shirt, both hands wrapped around the zipper pocket where he kept his inhaler. He was 7, small for his age, polite in the way scared children learn to be polite. Across from him, Maris sat with her back straight, and her old navy blue audiobook player beside her plate. 12 years old. No tears. No begging. Just one thumb, resting near the button she always touched when adults started speaking like she was not in the room. My father, Martin Mercer, set his fork down first. My mother folded her napkin into a square. That was how I knew this was not a conversation. It was a verdict. "Evelyn," my father said, "you need to stop pretending this is going to work." I looked at Caleb, then at Maris. "Not in front of them." My mother's voice came soft, church lady soft. "This is about them." Then my father looked at the boy, looked at the girl, and said the sentence that split my life into before and after. "Keep the boy. Send the girl back." The air conditioner clicked on. Somewhere in the kitchen, the ice maker dropped a handful of cubes. Caleb stopped breathing for half a second. Maris did not move. She only lowered her eyes to that little blue machine and pressed one button. What none of us knew then was that this was not the first thing she had recorded. And 19 days later, when Judge Anita Roswell walked into family court carrying a stack of documents thick enough to change every adult in that room, my father finally understood that children who are forced to listen learn how to remember. Please subscribe to support the channel. Here is a fun little challenge. I bet you are watching this video while lying down with your legs crossed right now. If I guessed correctly, type 3 in the comments. If not, type 4. Let's see how many viewers I got right. And if you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Your support helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. But before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, I need to take you back 9 months, to the night Maris and Caleb first came through my front door. Back then, my life ran on routes, weather alerts, and the kind of problems that could be solved with enough fuel, enough bottled water, and a road that had not washed away by morning. I worked disaster relief logistics out of Raleigh. I could reroute medical coolers around a flooded bridge before sunrise. I could stay calm while everyone else raised their voice. What I was not good at was noticing when my own life had become an empty room with working lights. I bought the little ranch on Alder Creek Drive after my divorce for $246,000, which was more money than I had ever signed my name under. It had one story: a leaning mailbox, a backyard fence with 3 missing pickets, and 2 bedrooms. I kept calling guest rooms even though no guests ever stayed there. I painted the hallway myself. I replaced the kitchen faucet after watching 2 videos and flooding the cabinet once. Broken things made sense to me. Empty things were harder. In October of 2024, I was standing in a warehouse outside Garner, counting cases of bottled water after a tropical storm, when my phone rang. The number belonged to the county office. I almost let it go to voicemail because 12 volunteers were waiting on delivery instructions, and 1 truck driver was threatening to leave. I answered anyway, clipboard still in my hand. The woman on the line told me there had been an accident on I-40. My old friend, Talia Price, was gone. Then she said, Talia had listed me years earlier as the person to call if anything ever happened to her children. I remembered signing that paper. I did not remember understanding it. There were 2 children, she said, a 7-year-old boy named Caleb and a 12-year-old girl named Maris. There was a pause before Maris's name. I heard it. You learn to hear pauses in my line of work. A pause usually means the road is worse than reported, the numbers are wrong, or somebody is about to make a human being sound like a problem. The boy is very sweet, the coordinator said. The girl is more complicated. I looked across that warehouse at the pallets, the clipboards, the neat black lines of my inventory sheets, and thought how easily adults turn children into categories when they are tired. Sweet, complicated, easy, difficult. Those words sounded harmless until you understood what people did with them. They kept one child. They returned another. They called it realism when what they meant was convenience. I asked only one question. Are they together right now? The coordinator said yes. I said, then bring them together. I did not say it bravely. I said it because there are some sentences you cannot unsay once a child is on the other end of them, even if the child cannot hear you yet. They arrived after dark in a county sedan with a woman who looked overworked enough to have forgotten what month it was. Caleb came out first, clutching a Spider-Man backpack against his chest. He had big eyes, skinny wrists, and an inhaler tucked into the front pocket, like a secret he had been warned not to lose. Maris stepped out behind him carrying a clear plastic storage bin with both arms. Not a suitcase, not a backpack, a storage bin. Inside were folders, pill bottles, school papers, a hoodie folded with military care, and the same navy blue audiobook player I would later see beside her dinner plate. Caleb looked at my porch light and whispered, "Is this where we sleep?" Maris did not look at the porch light. She looked at the driveway, the side gate, the neighbor's windows, the street lamp, and then me. Her eyes did not ask if I was kind. Kind adults had failed her before. Her eyes asked what doors locked, what doors opened, and how fast she could get Caleb out if this house became another place that changed its mind. Then she said the first sentence my daughter ever said to me. "Does the back door unlock from the inside?" At the time, I thought she was asking about safety. Later, I understood she was asking about escape. That first week, I learned Maris did not move through a house the way other 12-year-olds did. Caleb walked into a room looking for the softest place to sit. Maris entered like she was taking inventory of danger. She noticed where I stood, which drawers stuck, whether the hallway light worked, and how long it took the back door to close after someone let it swing. She never asked for snacks. She asked if Caleb could have one. She never asked which drawer was hers. She asked where I kept the spare inhaler, then corrected me when I put it in the bathroom cabinet because steam could affect it. At dinner, Caleb talked only after Maris looked at him first. He told me about baseball cards, about how he liked the catcher because catchers got to wear armor, about a dog he once saw outside a gas station and still thought about. Maris ate fast, but not greedily. Fast like food was a timed event. When she finished, she washed her plate, dried it, and put it back exactly where she found it. The first time I told her she could leave dishes in the sink, she gave me a polite little smile that said she had heard nicer lies from better actors. By the third night, I noticed she slept on top of the comforter in her hoodie, socks on, shoes lined up beside the bed with the toes facing the door. Caleb slept curled sideways with one hand under his cheek and the other wrapped around the strap of his backpack. Every night before Maris lay down, she checked his inhaler, his water bottle, and the small night light I had plugged into the hallway. She did it quietly, almost professionally, like a night watchman doing one last pass before the lights went out. One evening, I brought home 2 sets of sheets. Baseball print for Caleb, sage green for Maris, because I had noticed her staring at that color on a paint sample in the hardware store. Caleb tore his open right away and asked if the pillowcase could go on first. Maris thanked me, placed hers on the dresser, and left them inside the plastic. Not because she disliked them, because unpacking was a promise, and promises had been expensive in her life. Later that night, I passed their door and heard Caleb whisper, "Are we staying here?" There was a long silence. Then Maris answered, soft enough that I almost missed it. "You are. Not we, you." I stood in the hallway with my hand on the wall and understood something I had not wanted to understand. Maris was not trying to become my daughter. She was trying to make sure Caleb got the chance to become my son, even if the price was her disappearing before anyone had to ask. The first time my parents met them, I told myself it would be fine, because I needed it to be fine. That is a dangerous reason to believe anything. My mother had asked 3 times what Caleb liked to eat, and not once what Maris liked, but I filed that under adjustment. My father said children needed structure, and I told myself he meant bedtime, not obedience. They came on the last Sunday in November, just after 4, when the sky was already getting dark and the porch light made everyone look softer than they were. Martin Mercer arrived carrying a toolbox I had not asked for, because my father believed no house was truly owned by a woman until he had tightened something inside it. My mother, Lorna, carried a pound cake wrapped in foil and a gift bag with blue tissue paper sticking out of the top. Caleb saw the tissue paper and stood a little closer to Maris, not reaching, not asking, just noticing. Maris noticed too. She always noticed what was offered before she decided whether it was safe to want it. My mother melted for Caleb before she crossed the threshold. "Well, aren't you just a little gentleman?" she said, bending down with both hands on her knees like she was greeting a child from a church pageant. Caleb gave her his careful smile, the one that showed teeth but not trust. My father asked him if he knew how to throw a baseball, and when Caleb said a little, Dad laughed like that settled something important. "A boy needs a glove before he needs a lecture," he said, and ruffled Caleb's hair. Then my mother turned to Maris, and the air changed by half a degree. She did not bend down. She did not soften her voice. She looked at the storage bin tucked against the hallway wall, and then at Maris's cropped hair, her folded hands, her still face. "And you must be Maris," she said, in the tone people use when reading a name off a form. Maris said, "Yes, ma'am." My mother smiled, but it stopped before it reached her eyes. "What grade are you in, sweetheart?" she asked. Then, before Maris could answer fully, "Have you had any trouble keeping up?" I stepped in too lightly. That was my mistake. I said Maris was doing fine in school, that we were still settling in, that everyone needed time. I kept my voice pleasant because I had spent most of my life believing pleasant was the rent daughters paid to keep the family roof from leaking. Through the kitchen window, I watched my father walk Caleb into the backyard, showing him how to hold an imaginary bat. Caleb looked back twice to make sure Maris was still inside. Dinner was pot roast because I wanted normal. Normal is what people cook when they are begging a room not to reveal itself. My mother praised Caleb for using his napkin, for saying thank you, for finishing carrots he clearly hated. Maris passed the rolls, poured Caleb more water when he coughed, and answered every question carefully. My mother asked whether she had always been this quiet. My father asked if she understood how lucky she was. Nobody asked what she liked to read, or whether she missed her mother, or why a 12-year-old knew the expiration date on an inhaler. After dinner, my mother followed me into the kitchen with 2 plates in her hands. She waited until the water was running before she spoke. "Evelyn, I know your heart is in the right place," she said. That is how my mother opened a door before pushing someone through it. "The little boy is precious, anyone can see that, but the girl has a hardness to her. You need to be careful what you attach yourself to." I looked past her shoulder. Maris was in the dining room, clearing crumbs from the table into her palm, so quietly she could have disappeared while standing there. My father came in then, wiping his hands on his jeans like he had just finished a job. "The boy's got a chance," he said. "The girl's already carrying weather." He said it like weather was not something children survived, but something they chose to bring into a room. That should have been the moment I asked them to leave. Instead, I explained trauma, court timelines, sibling bonds, and stability to people who had already chosen not to understand. At the door, my mother hugged Caleb too long, touched Maris lightly on the shoulder like she was checking fabric, and whispered to me, "You do know you don't have to take both." Maris did not ask what she meant. She did not have to. Children who have been discussed in kitchens learn to understand whispers through running water. After they drove away, Caleb fell asleep on the couch, with the gift bag still unopened near his feet. Maris sat beside him until his breathing evened out, the old blue player resting against her knee. That night, I told myself, my parents just needed time. I wanted that to be true so badly that I mistook denial for patience. What I did not know was that they had already made their decision. They were not trying to understand my family. They were deciding which half of it deserved to stay. The campaign did not begin with shouting. That was what made it work. My parents were old enough to know that cruelty sounds different when you wrap it in concern. The first invitation came 2 weeks later, from my father, in a voicemail he left while I was unloading sandbags at a church basement in Cary. "Thought I'd take Caleb to a Durham Bulls game Saturday," he said. "Just some guy time. Maris probably wouldn't enjoy it anyway." He chuckled at the end, like he had offered something harmless. I called him back from the parking lot with rain dripping off my jacket. "They come together," I said. "Or not at all." There was a pause, the kind my father used when he wanted me to hear his disappointment before he named it. "Evelyn, don't turn a baseball game into a courtroom." I looked down at my boots, caked with red mud, and thought how easily men like my father mocked boundaries until they needed one respected. "I'm not," I said. "I'm turning it into a rule." Christmas made the shape of it harder to ignore. My parents came over with gifts stacked high enough to look generous from the driveway. Caleb got a new leather glove, a Durham Bulls cap, a batting tee, and a box of baseball cards wrapped in silver paper. My father said the glove had cost $129, though nobody had asked. For Maris, my mother handed over a thin package tied with white ribbon. Inside was a journal with pink flowers on the cover. The title read, "Better Choices for Better Girls." Maris thanked her. Of course she did. That was the part that made me want to put my fist through the wall. She thanked my mother like the gift had not just called her difficult in cursive. Lorna had written something on the first page in her church secretary handwriting. "Every young lady can learn to be easier to love." My mother watched my face, already dressed in innocence. Caleb leaned over to see, and Maris closed the cover before he could read it. Protecting him, even from the sentence meant to cut her. After that, the invitations came with one name missing: a pancake breakfast at church for Caleb, a hardware store trip with my father for Caleb, a neighborhood cookout where Lorna said Caleb could meet some normal families. Every time, I answered the same way: both children or neither. My mother sighed as if I were making life heavy on purpose. "Honey, nobody is excluding her," she said. "We just don't want to overwhelm the girl." But I had seen Maris's face when my phone lit up with my mother's name. Smooth, polite, gone behind the eyes. Then the messages started. I did not know that at the time, and that is the part I still replay when the house is quiet. I had given my mother both kids' numbers for emergencies. I still hate that sentence. While I was watching the front door, my mother found a side entrance. She texted Maris from a number saved as Mrs. Mercer, never Grandma, never Lorna, never anything warm enough to be claimed later. Sometimes, loving your brother means not standing in his way. Caleb could have grandparents, little league, a normal family. You are old enough to understand sacrifice. My father chose the garage for his part because that was where he had always believed serious things belonged. He came by one Thursday to check the water heater, though it worked fine. I found him under the pull chain light, arms folded, looking at me like I was a dented fender he might still be able to straighten. "You're 32, he said. "Don't tie yourself to a troubled girl, just because you're lonely." I said, "You're talking about a child." He answered, "I'm talking about reality." That night, after he left, I found a note taped inside the lid of Maris's storage bin. It was written in pencil, small and neat. "If I go first, Caleb keeps the inhaler, birth certificate, blue hoodie, baseball cards." Under that, she had listed 2 emergency numbers, and the name of a youth shelter 2 counties away. Nothing on the list belonged to her, not one thing. I sat on the floor beside that open bin, and finally understood the campaign was working. My parents were not trying to make me give Maris up. They were trying to make Maris believe giving herself up was love. The morning after I found that note, I called our county worker and asked if the next review could be moved up. I did not tell her everything yet. I was still doing that old daughter thing, weighing which truth was serious enough to become permanent once someone typed it into a file. She said the supervisor wanted to meet anyway. Placement stability review, she called it. Those 3 words sounded clean and harmless, the way official language often does before it puts its hands on a family. That was the first time I met Denise Halbrook. She was 48, maybe, with a gray blazer, perfect nails, and the kind of calm that did not comfort anybody. Her office had no pictures on the desk, only folders stacked by color and a ceramic mug that said best outcomes. Maris sat beside me with the blue player in her hoodie pocket. Caleb sat on her other side, swinging his feet under the chair. Denise looked at him first. People usually did. Then she looked at Maris, like she was reading the warning label before opening a box. "No one is questioning your intentions, Miss Mercer," Denise said, "but intentions and stability are not the same thing." She used words like risk profile, attachment disruption, long-term placement viability. Each phrase landed softly, like a pillow over a mouth. I asked whether there had been an actual concern from school, a doctor, a neighbor, anyone who had spent more than 10 minutes with both children. Denise folded her hands. Sometimes the concern is the pattern before the incident. I remember Maris going very still beside me. Stillness, with her, was never peace. It was weather pressure. Denise said Caleb was young enough to benefit from a clean permanency track before the next school year. Clean, that was the word she used. She said Maris might require a more therapeutic setting if the home became overwhelmed. She said sibling bonds mattered, of course, but they could not be allowed to endanger the more adaptable child. Caleb looked up at the word endanger and reached for Maris's sleeve without thinking. Denise saw it and wrote something down. That was when I understood she was not observing our family. She was building a version of it that could survive on paper without us. We were sent to the hallway while Denise took another call. I took Caleb to the water fountain because his breathing had gone thin. Maris stayed in the plastic chair outside the office, knees together, one hand tucked in her hoodie pocket. Later, I would learn the old player was on. At the time, I only saw a tired child staring at a bulletin board covered with smiling adoption posters. Behind the half-closed door, Denise's voice carried just enough to be dangerous. "The boy could be on a clean track by July," she said to someone inside. "The girl will sit in care until she ages out if we don't separate the file." A chair scraped, papers moved. Then she added, lower but not low enough. "If necessary, classify the girl as needing a therapeutic setting. The boy is the outcome we can still save." I did not hear those words that day. Maris did. In the car, when I asked if she was okay, she looked out the window at the county building shrinking behind us and said, "People like clean." Weeks later, when that recording played in court, I understood. Some adults did not want children safe. They wanted paperwork that looked safe from far away. By June, I had learned to read my mother's desserts the way other people read storm clouds. If she baked, she wanted praise. If she bought something, she wanted control. On Father's Day, she arrived at my house with a peach cobbler in a plastic grocery container, the price sticker still on the lid. My father came in behind her wearing the white short-sleeved shirt he saved for church picnics and family arguments. He kissed my cheek like he was forgiving me for something I had not done yet. I had set the table for 5 because I was still making the same mistake in different clothes. I still believed rules could teach people respect if I repeated them calmly enough. Caleb wore his Durham Bulls shirt and sat close to my left side. Maris chose the chair nearest the kitchen, not because it was comfortable, but because it gave her a clear line to the hallway. The old blue player rested beside her plate. She had started carrying it everywhere by then. I thought it soothed her. I did not yet understand it had become her witness. The meal moved with the fake smoothness of people stepping over broken glass. My father asked Caleb about baseball practice and nodded too hard at every answer. My mother praised him for cutting his meat carefully, then looked at Maris's untouched carrots and said, Some children make gratitude look effortless. Maris picked up her fork. Caleb stopped chewing. I said, Lorna. Just her name. A warning. My mother smiled at me as if I had spilled something small and embarrassing on the table. After the plates were mostly empty, my father leaned back and rubbed both hands over his face, performing the exhaustion of a man forced to say a noble thing. Evelyn, this has gone far enough, he said. Before court makes this harder to undo, you need to think like an adult. I felt the room narrow. I told him we were not discussing the children in front of the children. My mother folded her napkin into a neat square. This is about their future, she said softly. Especially his. My father pointed one finger toward Caleb without touching him. That boy still has a chance at a normal life. Then his eyes moved to Maris. Not to her face. To the space around her, like she was a problem taking up air. You can't save every stray that walks through your door. Caleb's hand went to the little zipper pocket where he kept his inhaler. Maris did not blink. Her thumb slid across the side of the blue player, slow and practiced. I said, do not call her that. My voice came out low enough that even my father paused, but men like Martin Mercer did not hear quiet as danger. They heard it as permission to keep going. He set his glass down and said the words that would later sound different when a judge read them from a transcript. Keep the boy, send the girl back. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Caleb whispered, no, so softly I almost thought I had imagined it. I stood up without pushing my chair back. That is how still my body went. You will leave my house now, I said. My mother's face tightened, but she did not look ashamed. She looked inconvenienced. On her way to the door, she stopped beside Maris and touched her shoulder with 2 fingers. If you love him, she whispered, don't make this harder. Maris looked down at the plate in front of her, then at the machine beside it. The red light blinked once under her thumb. After they left, Caleb asked if Grandpa could make courts take people away. I told him no because I needed him to sleep, not because I knew it was true. At 11:18 that night, I heard movement in the hallway and found Maris standing outside Caleb's room, recording the sound of him crying in his sleep. He kept saying, don't take Maris. I'll be good. That was the moment I stopped believing my parents were confused. Confused people misunderstand a family. My parents were trying to cut one in half. At 6:42 the next morning, while I was pouring cereal into 2 bowls nobody had touched yet, my phone rang. The county worker's name lit up on the screen, and I knew before I answered that something had moved overnight. People like my parents did not sleep after losing control. They drafted. They called. They found clean words for dirty work. I stepped into the laundry room and shut the door halfway, leaving enough space to see Caleb at the table and Maris standing at the sink with one hand wrapped around a glass she was not drinking from. There has been a complaint, the worker said. Her voice was careful in the way official voices get when they are trying not to become part of the harm. I want you to know, I'm not saying I believe it, but we are required to assess it. I asked who filed it. She paused. Anonymous. Of course it was. Respectable people love anonymous concern. It lets them throw stones and keep their church shoes clean. The complaint said Maris had a history of aggression, that Caleb appeared fearful, and that my household was becoming unstable. By 9 o'clock, the phrase pending review had entered my life and taken a chair at my kitchen table. Our hearing, the one I had circled on the calendar in blue marker, the one Caleb had been counting down to by drawing tiny baseballs in each square, was frozen 19 days before it was supposed to happen. I stood there with the phone in my hand and watched Maris read my face. She did not ask what happened. That was how I knew she already understood the shape of it. Children who have lived in files know when adults start writing a new one. The assessment team came that afternoon because allegations involving safety do not wait politely. They were kind. I need to say that. They took off their shoes at the door, spoke gently to Caleb, and asked permission before sitting beside Maris. They were doing the job that should exist. If the complaint had been true, I would have wanted them there. But truth and procedure do not always arrive holding hands. Sometimes procedure opens the door, and the lie walks in first wearing a badge that says concern. They asked Caleb whether Maris scared him. He looked at the woman's clipboard, then at Maris, then at me. His fingers went to his inhaler pocket. "No," he said. "She checks my breathing." The woman wrote that down. They asked Maris about the community center incident, the one my father had apparently turned into evidence. Maris said a man had grabbed Caleb's backpack in the parking lot, and she stood between them. Her voice stayed flat. Too flat. A child should not have to sound like a witness just to be believed. After they left, the house did not feel searched. It felt translated badly. Caleb stopped drawing baseballs on the calendar. Maris moved her storage bin from the closet back under her bed. Not packed, not unpacked, just ready. That was the cruelty of the complaint. It had not proven anything. It had not even changed the facts. But it had reached into my house and touched the oldest bruise my daughter had. "They are deciding about you again. Stand near the exit." That night, I sat at the kitchen table and opened a binder I had used for storm inventories. I wrote down dates, the baseball invitation, the journal, the missing name invitations, the garage conversation, Father's Day, the anonymous complaint. My handwriting stayed neat, because neat was what my hands did when my chest wanted to break furniture. Maris came downstairs for water and saw the binder open. For a second, she looked almost afraid. Then she said, "Paper remembers better than people." I looked at her then, really looked, and understood she was not speaking generally. The complaint was supposed to make Maris look dangerous. Instead, it made her careful, more careful than any 12-year-old should ever have to be. She carried the blue player closer after that, not like a toy, not like comfort, but like a small locked door only she knew how to open. I still did not know what was inside it. I only knew my parents had turned concern into a weapon, and someone at the county had given that weapon a case number. The part I could not see yet was that Maris had been collecting the bullets. 3 days after the assessment visit, I called Grant Sorell. His name came from a woman I knew through disaster relief. The kind of woman who kept emergency cash in her freezer and never recommended anyone twice unless they were worth trusting. Grant was 57, a family law attorney with a voice like gravel poured slowly into a jar. He listened without interrupting while I explained the complaint, the dinner, the missing name invitations, the journal, the garage conversation, and the way Maris had started carrying that blue player like it contained oxygen. When I finished, he did not say what people usually said. He did not say my parents meant well. He did not tell me to calm down. He asked, "What have you put in writing?" I looked at the binder on my kitchen table, the storm inventory tabs still labeled fuel, water, generators, medical. "Dates," I said. "Some quotes, messages I know about." He made a small sound, not approval exactly, more like a man finding a flashlight in a drawer during a blackout. "Good," he said. "Now stop treating this like a family misunderstanding. It has a case number." That sentence did something to me. It embarrassed me first, because some part of me still wanted permission to call my mother and ask why she was doing this, as if she would suddenly become honest in a private conversation where no one could hear her. Then it steadied me. Grant told me not to confront my parents, not to warn Denise, not to send emotional texts that could be printed without context and held up as instability. "People who control stories love private rooms," he said. "Do not meet them there." I wanted to argue. The good daughter in me was already reaching for the phone, already writing the speech where I would be firm but respectful, hurt but reasonable, protective but not cruel. I had given that speech in different forms since I was 12 years old. It had never changed the ending. Across the hallway, Caleb was building a tower out of cereal boxes, and Maris was sitting on the floor beside him, not playing, just watching the front window every few seconds like safety required maintenance. So I did what scared me more than yelling. I made official calls. I called the guardian assigned to the children. I called Maris's school counselor. I asked the community center for footage from the parking lot incident. I scanned every message I had. I wrote down every sentence I could remember, even the ones that made my hands shake. For once, I did not run ahead of the truth with a broom. I let it leave tracks. That evening, Maris came into the kitchen while I was labeling the binder. She stood there for a long time, before placing the blue player on the table between us. "If paper remembers," she said, "this does too." Then she looked toward the living room, where Caleb was humming to himself, and added, "But you have to promise you won't call them first." I understood who she meant, my parents. Denise. Every adult who would clean up their voice if warned. I put both hands flat on the table and said, "I promise." That was the first promise I made her that felt less like comfort and more like strategy. We listened to the first 12 recordings that night at my kitchen table. Grant was on speakerphone. Maris sat across from me with her knees pulled tight to her chest, the blue player between us like something alive. Caleb was asleep down the hall with cartoons still glowing blue against his wall. I thought I was prepared. I had already heard my parents say enough cruel things to last a lifetime. But hearing them in Maris's small saved files was different. A spoken wound changes shape when you realize a child carried it alone. The early recordings were what I expected, and still could barely stand. My mother's voice, soft as folded linen, telling Maris that Caleb deserved grandparents who could show up without tension. My father in my garage, saying boys needed a family name more than girls needed second chances. Denise in that hallway, turning my children into outcomes. Every few minutes, Grant would stop us and ask for the date, the location, who was present. He was not cold. He was careful. Careful was what rage had to become, if we wanted it to survive court. Then recording 27 played, and the air in my kitchen changed. Denise was speaking to someone whose name we never caught. Her voice was lower, hurried. "If we separate them, close the boy clean, and mark the girl therapeutic, nobody revisits the Medford file." Grant interrupted so fast his chair scraped through the phone. "Play that again," he said. Maris pressed the button. Denise's words came back thinner the second time, but worse. Not because I understood them, because Grant did. "What is the Medford file?" I asked. Grant did not answer right away. I heard papers moving on his end, then the slow breath of a man choosing his words. "Maybe nothing," he said, which meant something. By morning, he had filed the proper requests through the guardian and the court. No backdoor calls, no favors, no warnings. The truth would move through channels Denise could not wipe clean just because she heard footsteps coming. What came back was not a full story, but it was enough to show the pattern. 3 years earlier, Denise had supervised another sibling placement in Medford County. A younger boy had been moved quickly into a permanent home. His older sister had been labeled therapeutic, then placed in group care after 2 failed reviews. There had been complaints afterward. Missing notes. A timeline that changed twice. Nothing had stuck, because nothing had been recorded by the child everyone called difficult. I sat with that file summary in my hands and felt something colder than anger. Maris was not Denise's first complication. She was just the first one who had proof. Across the table, Maris watched me read. She did not look surprised. That may have been the worst part. A 12-year-old girl had expected adults to sort children into keepable and inconvenient because experience had already taught her the system had shelves. I wanted to promise her Denise would lose her job, that my parents would apologize, that the judge would see everything exactly as it was, but promises had been expensive in Maris's life, and I had learned not to spend what I did not have. So I said the only true thing I could. "This goes in the binder." Maris nodded once. Not relieved. Not yet. Just a little less alone. The night before court, my parents let me know they were coming through a text from my mother, not a phone call. "Caleb deserves family in the room," she wrote, as if Maris were furniture we had forgotten to mention. 3 minutes later, my father sent his own message. "Don't embarrass us in front of a judge." I read both messages at the kitchen table with Grant's binder open beside me. For once, My hands did not shake. There is a strange calm that comes when people finally become exactly who they have been threatening to be. Denise sent her notice at 4:17 that afternoon. She would be recommending a temporary separate placement evaluation until the safety review was fully resolved. The words looked clean on the page. They always did. But by then, clean words did not impress me. I had heard what they sounded like before someone polished them. Grant read the notice once, then slid it into the front pocket of the binder. "Let them come," he said. "People who believe the room belongs to them usually talk too much in it." That night, I ironed Caleb's shirt and Maris's green dress, while both of them sat on my bedroom floor pretending not to watch me. Caleb asked if judges were allowed to split people up. I told him judges were supposed to listen before they decided. Maris looked at me then, quick and sharp. "Adults listen different when paper is involved," she said. I wanted to say that was not always true. Instead, I said, "That's why we brought paper." She nodded once, like I had answered the question she actually asked. Maris kept the blue player in the pocket of her hoodie until bedtime. When I told her the files were already copied and safe with Grant, she still touched the pocket like a person checking for a pulse. I did not ask her to put it away. Some children carry blankets. Some carry stuffed animals. My daughter carried proof. Before she went to bed, she stood in my doorway and said, "If they ask me why I recorded, what do I say?" I told her, "The truth." She looked down the hall toward Caleb's room. "The truth is, people believe adults first." I sat beside her on the edge of my bed. "Then tomorrow," I said, "we let the truth bring receipts." It almost made her smile. Almost. Down the hall, Caleb had laid his baseball shirt across a chair, smoothing the sleeves flat like it was a person he was trying not to wake. On the back, in washable marker, he had written one word between the shoulder blades: both. The courthouse the next morning smelled like floor wax, old paper, and coffee that had been burning too long. My parents were already there when we arrived. My mother wore pearls, and the soft wounded face she used when she wanted strangers to ask what had happened to her. My father stood beside her with his arms crossed, guarding a version of the story where he was the only sensible man left. Denise sat near the front with a folder on her lap, calm as a locked drawer. Judge Anita Roswell entered carrying more than one folder. That was the first thing I noticed. Not just our petition. Not just the complaint. A stack. Thick, squared, marked with colored tabs. She set it on the bench slowly, like weight mattered. Caleb reached for Maris's hand under the table. "Maris, let him have it." Then Judge Roswell put on her glasses, looked over the room, and said, "Before this court considers separating these children, we are going to discuss how that idea entered the file." Judge Roswell opened with the complaint. Not the petition. Not the home study. The complaint. She read the line about Caleb being fearful of Maris, then looked at the assessment worker seated near the aisle. "What did the child say when asked directly?" The woman stood with her notebook. "He said Maris checks his breathing," she answered. "He denied being afraid of her." My mother shifted behind me. I did not turn around. Some sounds are better heard without giving them your face. Then Judge Roswell asked about the community center incident. Denise began to explain, but Grant was already standing. Victor Ames had sent the footage through the proper channel, time-stamped and clear. On the small courtroom screen, we watched Maris step between Caleb and a drunk man reaching for his backpack. She did not hit him. She did not chase him. She planted her 12-year-old body in front of her brother and refused to move. Judge Roswell let the silence sit. "So the first example of aggression," she said, "appears to be protection. After that, the room belonged to the blue player. Grant did not play every recording. He did not need to. A transcript was enough for some wounds." My father's voice came first through Grant's reading. "Boys carry a name. Girls carry trouble." Then my mother's. "Sometimes loving your brother means not standing in his way." Then Denise's, cleaned of nothing. "The boy is the outcome we can still save." My mother whispered, "I was protecting him." Judge Roswell looked over her glasses. Protection does not require teaching a child to disappear. Denise tried to call the Medford file irrelevant. The judge disagreed before Grant finished his sentence. Missing notes. Changed timelines. Another older girl labeled difficult, while a younger boy was moved cleanly forward. This court will not decide a child's future based on an adult's convenience dressed as expertise, Judge Roswell said. Denise's calm cracked then, not loudly, but enough. Her pen stopped moving. Her folder closed. For the first time since I had met her, she looked like someone whose paperwork could not carry her out. Then the judge turned to Maris. You may speak, if you want to. Maris stood because Caleb squeezed her hand once and let go. She held the edge of the table, not the player. I didn't record them to get anyone in trouble, she said. I recorded them because when kids tell the truth about adults, adults ask what the kid did first. Nobody breathed the same after that. Caleb stood too small for the room, and somehow braver than all of us. If Maris goes, I go, he said. She's not the scary part. She's the reason I sleep. Judge Roswell allowed the placement to continue together and ordered no private contact from my parents while the case moved forward. Denise's conduct would be referred for internal review. It was not fireworks. It was better than fireworks. It was the sound of a door staying open because the right person finally read every page. Outside the courthouse, Caleb took a marker from my purse and wrote Mercer Price on the back of his baseball shirt under the word both. That night, I changed the labels on the 2-bedroom doors. Not guest room 1 and guest room 2. Caleb's room. Maris's room. Maris kept the blue player on her nightstand while Grant preserved the files. Then she put on an audiobook for the first time and let someone else tell a story while she fell asleep. She still checked the lock before bed. Maybe she always would, but she checked it from the inside, in a house where nobody had to earn a place by being easy to love. The lesson I took from all of this is simple, but it took me 32 years and 2 frightened children to understand it. Love is not what people say when the room is warm and everyone is behaving. Love is what people do when the choice costs them something. It is easy to love the child who smiles on command, says thank you, plays the sport you understand, and makes your family look good in photographs. It is much harder to love the child who flinches before she trusts, who checks the lock twice, who carries proof because life taught her that adults rewrite stories, but that is where love matters most. Family is not supposed to be a place where the easiest person gets chosen and the wounded person gets returned. A home should not be a tryout. A child should not have to perform sweetness to earn a bed, a last name, or a place at the table. And sometimes, the people who taught us the word family are the very people we have to protect our family from. That was the hardest part for me, not the court, not the complaint, not even hearing my parents' words read out loud. The hardest part was accepting that being a good daughter could not matter more than becoming a safe mother. There comes a moment in life when peace is no longer the same as silence. Sometimes peace begins the day you stop explaining your boundaries to people who benefit from crossing them. Maris did not heal all at once. Caleb did not stop being afraid overnight. Real healing is quieter than that. It looks like a child using a recorder to listen to a story instead of saving evidence. It looks like a boy writing both on the back of his shirt. It looks like 2-bedroom doors with names on them. So if this story stays with you, let it be this. Love is not proven by who you keep when it is easy. Love is proven by who you refuse to send away when they are hardest to hold. If you believe family should be built by actions, not empty words, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, who in your life chose you when it cost them something?